Okay, so the question was a question about what's called trigger warnings. Trigger warnings, you're probably familiar with this, are try to deal with the issue of students who might be reading material that for personal reasons is uncomfortable to them. So I've not encountered, in my experience, anybody issuing trigger warnings or students asking for trigger warnings to be given. Not in my classes, but also in colleagues' classes. So the question was, what's the attitude at Harvard? As far as that, has not arisen at Harvard. I think the attitude that most people in the humanities feel is that a lot of this stuff is distressing. That's part of the reason that we're reading it, and part of the reason why it's, we recognize that, and we tried, as part of one of the things we're trying to deal with. Teaching literature is not therapy, right? But it's a way of exposing people to things in the world that they might not want to think too hard about. So I don't have any personal experience with that, but it is something that's been written a good deal about. Yes?
Let me use the mic.
I can repeat the question either way.
Because of other forces like global technological competition and government support of education in that line, and the increasing cost per student loans and education, isn't that driving a need to go to a university for a vocational end to be able to pay off your expenses, getting your education, and pushing the humanities aside? So the humanities are a victim, no matter how well they're presented or marketed, they're the victim of our whole global situation.
Yep, okay, so that's a huge issue. Did everybody hear the question? Okay, government investment in education is an investment in producing a trained workforce. That's the justification for it. That's why we do it. So it's not as though we should raise an eyebrow at the fact that this kind of funding goes to fields where there's a lot of growth and development and a lot of global competition. You're totally right about that. It's totally rational. We should support that kind of investment. What happened after the Second World War, after 1945, was that for the first time, government agencies funded academic scientific research. They had actually never done that before 1945. The government had their own labs. But the Defense Department, the National Foundation for Science, the National Institutes of Health, NASA, all began funding scientific research in universities. As you'll probably recall, if you remember that era, the funding formula was such that the funders had to provide what was called cost overhead. So that when a scientist got funding to do something in a lab, a particular project from a government agency, there was a certain, I think 20% was tacked on to cover the costs of the parking lots and the janitors and the electricity and whatnot. And that money flowed into other departments. So the tide raised lots of boats. So the classics department, the philosophy department benefited from the fact that the science departments were generating all this funding. So that started to dry up a little bit with the end of the Cold War and for lots of other reasons, and the government's a little more strict about where that money's going. So one of the reasons for the growth in all these other areas has to do with the fact that government was pumping money into science, particularly after Sputnik, and it helped raise, as I said, all these other fields. So that's not the problem. That's what higher education should be doing, and that's what government subsidies of higher education should be doing. And the problem isn't that we don't have enough classics majors. The problem is we don't have enough people taking classics. So we would want, I think as a society, everybody who goes through a 4-year program of higher education and becomes an engineer or goes to Silicon Valley or wherever economic growth is happening out in the world, takes courses in fields besides STEM. We want them to take courses not just in art and literature and philosophy, but courses in sociology and history, anthropology, and so forth, because it makes them more well-rounded, actually will make them more successful at the work they're going to do, and also gives them a fuller life for the rest of their lives. This is their only chance to get that. They're not going to get it later on. There's a fantasy I think every 18-year-old has. They're going to invent an app, make $100 million, and retire at 25. It's not going to happen. You're not going to have time to do all that reading that you didn't do in college. This is your bite at the apple. So take it now. So the question really is, what's a real education involved? And real education involves as much of everything as we can possibly expose students to, understanding that many of them, for financial reasons or just because of ambition, want to go into technological fields. I don't think we should have a problem with that. What we should do is try to make what we're doing part of everybody's education. Oh, I got worked up about that question. Yes, sir.
You make the warrant for the humanities, you articulate in terms of knowledge, and you're averse to using the W word, wisdom, but as I hear you describe what the humanities want to do is associated with what I connote as wisdom. Can you talk about your choice of words there?
Yeah, did everybody hear that? Okay, so I used the word knowledge. I avoided the word wisdom in describing what humanities has to offer. So I do that for two reasons. One is that it is knowledge. It's not, because it's not quantifiable in certain ways, it doesn't mean that it's not knowledge. You actually learn something by taking courses in philosophy and literature and the other humanities subjects. It's a certain skill, a certain way of reading and making sense critically of what you're trying to understand, understanding the meaning of things, but it's knowledge. And there's also a lot of just straight knowledge. I mean, who these people were, when these books were written, what was going on, and so forth. So I like to use the word because I like to emphasize that we're contributing to knowledge just as much as any other discipline is. I don't like the word wisdom because I don't like the idea that because I've read a lot of books, I'm any wiser than the person next door, because I think it's not true. Just in my experience. I mean, my dad was a professor too, so I've known a lot of professors. They're not wiser than, you know, airplane pilots or doormen or whatever. And I think, so I don't like the idea that somehow we've got access to some special form of knowledge that other people don't have. I just think that we try to be good at what we do and to be models of how to think about what we do to students, as everybody does who teaches. And I think, to me, that's an adequate justification for it. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for your very stimulating talk. In Washington at the Supreme Court, there was a discussion about affirmative action, a case that's been around for about 7 or 8 years. It's back in front of the court. And in the back and forth with the attorneys present, Justice Scalia said, well, why should anybody assume that going to an elite university for reasons of diversity and typical liberal arts reasons are good for African Americans? Maybe they should go to other schools where the pace isn't so quick and they could just slow down. No, my immediate thought after hearing your talk is maybe they should be in PhD programs and take 9.5 years and get PhDs in English. But it reminded me of a dispute in the American past within the African American community between Booker T. Washington, who started the Tuskegee Institute to give African Americans technical education, and Edward Du Bois, who wrote The Souls of Black Folks, who insisted that one of the rights that was being denied to African Americans more than any other was the right to liberal education. So I'm wondering if you see, as part of the dispute about the role of the humanities, something about race in America.
Yeah, thank you. You're familiar with this case called Fisher against Texas. It came to the court 2 years ago and had to do with affirmative action admissions policies at UT. And the court basically punted. They kicked it back to the appellate court to gather more information. And the issue was whether Texas could accomplish its goal of racial diversity on its campus by other means than using race as a criterion in admissions. And the court was supposed to get the university to present a case for this. So I did read some of the articles that you were referring to about the oral argument that took place yesterday or the day before, and yeah, Scalia did say those things. And it sounds as though the court may have lost its majority in upholding the Texas policy. It looks like the Texas policy is in a little bit of trouble. This is obviously an issue that's been around for about 20 years in higher education, really since the Bakke. So it was 1978, the Bakke decision. Every highly selective institution basically uses some kind of race as a as a factor in admissions for the stated purpose of having a racially diverse student body on the theory that that enhances educational experience for the students. Now, I'm in favor of a racially diverse student body. There's something about the rationale, that's a little creepy, because it sounds like it'd be good for white students to have non-white students around. Should we just be thinking about the white students here? So there's a weird way in which that enforces a certain kind of ethnocentrism or racial centrism in higher education, particularly at these highly selective schools. So it is something to worry about, a little bit about what the purpose of it is. We want to be able to say that everybody benefits from being in a diverse learning environment, whites and non-whites, and we want to be able somehow to show that in ways that Texas apparently couldn't do very successfully for the court. So I'm a little worried that the era of affirmative action, the era in which the court is happy to accept affirmative action in this one special case, which the court kind of carved out of constitutional law, might be coming to an end. I think what places try to do, and schools that can afford it like Harvard, Princeton, and Yale do, Stanford, is A, just recruit very heavily in places where they're likely to be able to attract different kinds of students. That includes international students, which are also very heavily recruited now. And second, to provide financial aid to as many students as possible. So those schools have incredibly generous financial aid packages. Students basically pay nothing to go there who otherwise couldn't afford it. But that's a way to kind of get these populations in. So the studies that have been made, now the study that's been made called The Bend in the River, which is now about 15 years old, by William Bowen and Derek Bach, concluded that affirmative action had had a positive effect on the number of non-whites in the professions, for example, medicine. That increased, and the increase could be traced to the benefits of affirmative action admissions policies in higher education and also professional schools. So that's an argument that the system is working, but it's a slightly different argument from the argument that it increases educational enrichment for students because you have non-white people in the classroom. So these are just thoughts. I don't have I'm in favor of affirmative action as long as the court is for it, because I think it's a good thing to do. I think meritocracy is an exploded concept anyway. I mean, what are we really measuring out there? We're trying to find interesting people. We're trying to create an interesting student body in which not everybody is exactly the same as everybody else. But I do think that maybe constitutionally the time has run out on that. The biggest impact of if the court were to decide in Fisher's favor in this case, Fisher was a student, a UT student. Student didn't get into UT, who brought the lawsuit. Would have an immediate impact, of course, on public institutions for obvious reasons, but it also has an impact on almost every private institution because every private institution takes public money. So any kind of non-discriminatory ruling would have an effect on practices at every college and university in the United States. That'll change the demographics a little bit. I can't comment on Scalia's remark. That seems like a racist remark to me, so I can't. I mean, all African Americans would be better off at less strong schools. That's crazy. But the goal is a good goal, and it's going to be increasingly hard to reach it. That's a tough question.
Just a follow-up to that, I thought Scalia was a little less articulate than usual, but when he made that remark, but I thought he was referring to research that has shown over and over again, I believe, that when you admit students with lower scores to schools like U of T, you get that diversity, but those students don't graduate in the same numbers as the students who had the preparation. So there's that argument too, that it hasn't been effective. I mean, you just presented evidence to the contrary, but there seems to be quite a bit of evidence that affirmative action has failed the students it was meant to help in many cases because they get into schools where they can't succeed.
Okay. So I'll continue to talk about this. I want to say one more thing about it. There's a group of students at every major university in the United States who have lower board scores than the average student. These students tend to live together. They tend to eat together and socialize together. They tend to have poorer grades than other students at the university. And they seem to get less out of their education in terms of their future career opportunities. Those students are varsity athletes, right? They're selectively recruited. They're given, that's used as a criterion in admissions, and they get in, and they play sports for the university. And all the studies that have been done about college athletics shows that that group of students doesn't really benefit from being in university. What's more important, really? What's more important? What's more important? Having people who normally wouldn't be there have an opportunity to be there and to mix with other people who do have that opportunity, or a football team, really. So the idea that there's some sort of major meritocratic crisis here because we're dealing with race, we should think about all the other ways in which we don't observe neutrality when we do college admissions. We're always looking for people for all kinds of reasons. But also, as everybody talks about, legacies. At Harvard, you have a much better chance of getting into Harvard if you had a parent who went to Harvard. There's also the children of rich people who put a building up if you get their kids into school. So all that stuff is part of it. It's not great, though, that stuff, but everybody accepts that. But they have a little bit of a problem with much smaller numbers of people who are admitted because of their race. So to me, it's not a great argument.
One more question.
I'll take a chance. Thank you very much. Appreciate your thoughts. You seem to be making an argument a little while ago, which I would certainly support, for something like a strong core curriculum for undergraduates. In other words, the requirement that undergraduate students take courses in a variety of disciplines as part of an undergraduate education. And I certainly would support that if that's what you were saying. But it doesn't really get to the main point of your talk, which is how do you address the problem of siloization in graduate programs? And I just wondered if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah. So to your first point, I'm a big believer in general education. So general education courses are courses that every student is required to take to graduate outside of their major or concentration. And most American colleges use a distribution requirement system in which students are required to take usually 3 courses in each of the 3 divisions, natural science, social science, and arts and humanities, in order to graduate. And that's the reason that most colleges adopt that as a general education program is because it's very cheap. Because you don't have to create new courses, you're just using department courses to satisfy general education requirements. It's more expensive and more complicated politically and for lots of other reasons to create a set of courses that are specifically general education courses. So that's what Columbia has. That's Columbia Literature Humanities, their great books courses, Contemporary Civilization. Harvard has it. Stanford has some of the courses are general education courses. There you have to create non-departmental courses. You have to get faculty from departments, get departments to release them to create and teach those courses. And you have to give them some kind of institutional support that the students think that they're important to take. It's very hard to do. We've had a terrible time trying to do it at Harvard. It's difficult because it just runs against the grain of what most people are trained to do, which is to teach their own specialties. So I'm a big believer in not just teaching our specialties, but being able to teach in a broader way to non-specialists. That's one of the ways that we get our message out to kids who are going to be doing something quite different with their lives. So I think that's a very good thing to do. Part of the problem with creating general education courses is because, as I said, we're all trained in our graduate programs to be specialists, and we're all rewarded for being good specialists. So it's not just that we aren't really trained to teach people who are not going to be specialists in our fields. We could probably do that. But we're never really trained to think about what every educated person ought to know, which is what you have to think about when you're creating a set of general education requirements. The question you're asking yourself is, what should every college graduate know before they graduate from my college? Nobody's thought about that before. We've never had to think about it. So when you get into these faculty debates about what every college student ought to know or what ought to be required, you hear some very hair-raising ideas because people have ideas about it, but they haven't really thought it through. So it's very difficult to get faculty to focus on this. Because it doesn't affect them, it doesn't interest them, it's not something that's really been part of their own education. They generally tend to say, oh, I took a great music course, maybe I ever should take a music course, stuff like that. So it's, in order to, if you want to have faculty who are able to teach students who are non-specialists, and faculty you can think about knowledge dissemination in ways that are outside the normal disciplinary frameworks, you have to train them to think that way. You have to make doctoral education a much different experience than we make it now. And I don't see that happening. I mean, it's been the same for hundreds of years, 100 and some years. And the people who are professors are pretty invested in that system because they benefited from it. They don't like the idea of making it easier to get a PhD or changing the nature of requirements. But to me, that's where reform is going to happen. Doctoral education is the bedroom. It's where we reproduce ourselves. Right? And if we want to produce different kinds of offspring, we have to address that.
I think that's a good note to end on. If you want to continue your conversation with Dr. Menand, we're having a book signing out here in the exhibition hall. And since the holiday season is upon us, it's a good Christmas present. But please continue the conversation with him, and I hope to see you at our next program. Thank you very much. Good night.